Welcome to The Art of Happiness. I'm Arthur Brooks. This episode of the podcast is going to air the day after Valentine's Day. We're recording it a few days before. And a lot of people are going to be thinking about the life that they want, the romantic life that they want. Many of you are in really happy relationships, and that's great. But I've been looking at data recently. It's what I do. It's fun to be a social scientist. And there's more people than ever that are not in romantic relationships, in fact, are not in very many relationships at all, and against their will. There's more isolation and there's more loneliness in the United States than we've seen ever since we've been keeping records. I've written about this a little bit in my column in The Atlantic, but I've been interested in it for a long time because it's a growing trend. The Surgeon General of the United States under President Obama, and when he's confirmed also under President Biden, is Vivek Murthy. And he's been on the show before, and he said that we have an epidemic of loneliness. So as we think about our relationships, what we can do for ourselves and what we can do for each other, I want to take on that topic today. Loneliness is a major source of unhappiness. It's growing. We need solutions. That's our subject today. How do we fight the epidemic of loneliness? Today we're going to welcome onto the podcast Noreena Hertz, who's a best-selling author from the UK, is going to talk about it. She's going to give us some solutions. She's going to challenge our thinking a little bit. And when we're done, I hope that everybody who's listening will ask him or herself, what can I do to make the loneliness epidemic a little less hard on somebody that I love? What a delight it is today to welcome Noreena Hertz to The Art of Happiness. I've been looking forward to this interview really since I started paying attention to Noreena's new work on loneliness, which of course is our topic today. Loneliness is something that's occupied me as a happiness researcher for years and years. And there's been a few really, I think, inflecting works that changes people's consciousness on the subject. And Noreena's work is one of the books that's doing that. It's her new book, The Lonely Century, Coming Together in a World That's Pulling Apart, is a huge bestseller in the UK and all across Europe, and is now just coming to the United States. Now, I have no doubt that it's going to tear up the US market as well. Interesting that a hot topic would be something like loneliness, and that's what we need to talk about today. Let me tell you a little bit about Noreena, and then she'll speak for herself because she's got a lot to say. Noreena Hertz, she studied philosophy and economics at University College London, where she's currently a faculty member. But between that and now, she took her MBA at Wharton. She did a PhD at the University of Cambridge. She's written lots of books and been involved in the private sector in various means. For example, she's a board member of Warner Music, which is got to be great and interesting and fascinating. She's written a bunch of best-selling books such as The Silent Takeover and The Debt Threat and Eyes Wide Open, but most recently, The Lonely Century, Coming Together in a World That's Pulling Apart. She's been talking about it all over the place, and there's intense interest in it. This is not a matter of triviality. Quite the contrary. This is something that's on a lot of people's minds, both people who are observing what's going on in our society and people who are suffering as well. So that's what we're going to talk about today. Welcome to The Art of Happiness, Noreena.
Well, thank you for having me on.
It's a delight to have you. And as I look back on your work, you're an economist like me, and you've done traditionally more, I guess, conventional economic work. Well, not conventional, but at least something that you'd associate with economists. You've written about geopolitical trends. You've tackled topics such as problems of modern capitalism and third world debt. And now you've turned to loneliness. Is that a departure or not?
No, I actually see this very much as a follow-up to my first kind of big global bestseller, The Silent Takeover, which looked at the consequences of neoliberal capitalism. And in many ways, this book, in my mind, is a follow-up to that. But it also came from my experience as a professor, because students were coming into my office in office hours in increasing numbers and confiding in me how lonely they felt. And that was a new phenomenon. I'd been teaching for around 20 years and I hadn't seen this body of students coming into my office. And that was my first kind of inkling that something perhaps different was going on. And at the same time, in my academic research, I'd been researching the rise of right-wing populism across the globe. And one of the things that had been coming out from the testimonies of right-wing populist voters who I'd been hearing from was how lonely they felt. So two things kind of happening at once, making me think there's something interesting going on here. Loneliness is in many ways a lens through which we can understand what is going on in the world right now, how people are feeling, how people are voting, economic decisions they're making. And that's when I started really digging into it.
So you talked about the fact that you were studying people on the political right, populists in Europe, and then you were dealing with your students, and they were basically saying the same things about loneliness, which suggests to us, given the fact that I'm sure your students were overwhelmingly on the political left, that this is not a political phenomenon per se, correct?
This is not a political phenomenon. Loneliness can affect everyone, rich, poor, male, female, whatever their political persuasion, young and old, although interestingly, the young are the loneliest. We also know that people on lower income, people who are unemployed, are lonelier than average. So loneliness does have can have an economic dimension. And yet the problem is so pervasive and so widespread that it's not only one of these groups that has it. With 1 in 5 American adults lonely even before the pandemic, 1 in 5 millennials not having a single friend, we know that the problem is much more widespread.
Yeah, this is important to emphasize as well, because there's a tendency to say that it's these exogenous social or political or economic circumstances that are unique to particular groups that are creating this problem. But you're finding that in the two groups that you met with at the very beginning that stimulated your interest in this problem, that put you on the case, sort of this beginning of your Sherlock Holmes adventure into understanding loneliness, it was two very, very diverse groups complaining about the same problem. Perhaps looking for solutions and not finding them. So tell me, when the students would come into your office, I mean, I love students and I love office hours because when the students come to talk about, I teach happiness, they want to talk about their lives, and their lives are really, really interesting. So what were they telling you when they were talking about the fact that they were lonely? I'm assuming that they were, what were they, undergraduates, graduates? How old were they?
So mainly graduate students I was teaching, and of different political persuasions, actually. Different political persuasions. I wouldn't say that my student body is only on the left by any means. But they were coming, and and what it's like in office as you get to know students, they confide in you not only about their work, but as you say, about their lives. And many were saying to me that they were finding life hard because they felt isolated, that they felt invisible. That was a word that they felt excluded. And there was something else that I noticed. It was more of an observation. When I was setting students group assignments, I was noticing that many were struggling with face-to-face interactions in a way that I'd never seen before. And I actually raised this with a colleague, somebody who runs one of America's most prestigious universities. And he said to me, we're seeing exactly the same thing here. In fact, it's so bad here that we're having to run remedial how to read a face in real life classes for some of our incoming students, because they're arriving and they're so used to only communicating on their screens, on their phones, that students are really coming to one of the top universities in the US unable to effectively communicate face-to-face. And as I researched that phenomenon in greater depth, I found that this is even amongst the youngest children amongst us, nursery school teachers, talking about children arriving at nursery school lacking very fundamental social skills, something new that they've seen in recent years, because their parents are so much on their phones that they're not imparting those basic social skills to their children. Now, technology is not the only driver for why we're in the midst of a loneliness crisis, but clearly social media and our smartphones are part of the problem.
And one of the things I want to get into a little bit later in our conversation is the extent to which that social media and screens are the cause or the consequence of the problem. People will go out looking for, as economists, we always talk about consumer phenomena as actually products are following demand. And so if people are lonely, then they'll look for a solution to loneliness. And we have to ask whether or not social media and screens people are looking to them as a solution. And I've looked into that a little bit in my own research as well, but we're not quite there yet, because I first want to ask you, when you first were hearing these stories about isolation, about invisibility, about the intense difficulty of connecting with other people, especially face to face, could you relate to it in any way? Is this just the ennui of being 24? Or is it something really new? Because look, you and I were 24 at one point, and it's the Sturm und Drang of strong emotion, and I'm less lonely now than I was then, even though I had more friends than I have now. So is it just a function of age, and can you remember feeling that way, or is it really something different?
Well, that's a great question, because whenever we're talking about generations and talking about phenomenon that a generation are experiencing, it's always important to ask, is it just because they're at that age, or is this a cohort issue? Is there something about this generation? And I think it is something unique to this generation. It's not, and I think when it comes to the young, we don't need to go into this quite yet, but when it comes to young, I think the thing that is strikingly different is their consumption of social media and the way that they now communicate, that it is different. And I know that one risks sounding like a Luddite at these moments. And, of course, there've been, every time there was some sort of new technological innovation, there were people who said, oh, no, Socrates was worried that writing would be bad because we'd stop using our memory, of course. But
kids these days, I know. I read a pretty interesting story from the New York Times in 1896 saying that the telephone was going to take away our fundamental ability to communicate. So, yeah, there's nothing new under the sun.
No,
but anyway, go on.
The difference is that we've never been permanently connected to a device in the way that we now are, and the young especially are. And we've never had kind of so much of our communication, and with the young, almost all their communication often mediated via technology. So I think there is something qualitatively different here. And I don't think this isn't just young people feeling sad or excluded. This is that on steroids.
No kidding. So let's look at the data now, because, you and I as social scientists, we tell some stories, but fundamentally our hearts beat faster when we see the data on the subject. So empirically speaking, what's your evidence that things, not that they're bad now, but they're worse than they were when we were that age?
Do you mean in terms of loneliness in general? Or do you mean...
Yeah. How that loneliness has increased. And so the loneliness that you were hearing in your office hours is worse than the loneliness that we felt when we were that age.
So we have got longitudinal data. So we have got data over periods of time. There have been big studies, for example, of 15-year-olds across countries. So big studies with huge sample sizes of tens of thousands of students. And what they found, that looking over the past 15 years, we see a kind of steady increase in young people reporting that they are lonely, for example. And other longitudinal studies that we've seen also support the idea that the hypothesis that loneliness is increasing. What we know as well is that during the pandemic, loneliness has spiked up even more. And the research that has been coming out over the last few months makes that clear.
Yeah, no, I can imagine that. Now let's talk not just about young people, but what do the data say about loneliness for people my age? I'm a 56-year-old man. I've got a good stable life and a job and a family and the whole deal. But I've heard at least anecdotal evidence and some quantitative evidence as well that people my age are suffering more from loneliness too. Is that correct, according to what you say in your book and what you've learned?
Everyone on average is lonelier than they were in the past, but some groups are even lonelier. So yes, it wouldn't be surprising that you or your peers were experiencing more loneliness today. That would make sense. There's also a kind of a loneliness. When I define loneliness, I'm not just talking about feeling that you're lacking friends or intimacy or company. It is that too, but I'm also talking about a more existential state of loneliness. Loneliness is feeling disconnected, not only from your friends and family, but also from your fellow citizens, from your employer, from the state. And I think on those counts, for sure, we're seeing people feeling increasingly lonely, whatever their political persuasion, or circumstance.
Yeah, and you have to wonder, and we'll talk about it later, whether or not the political polarization, the extreme radicalism that we see on left and right in the United States and around the world, whether or not that's an answer to it, as people are looking for identity and looking for community, whether or not they would identify more with groups that have higher levels of bonding social capital. But you just made a point that I want to emphasize. It's really important, which is that loneliness is not the same thing as being alone. Loneliness is about isolation, about a sense of being actually isolated. So you can be lonely in a crowd and you can be profoundly contented living alone in a cabin, correct?
Absolutely. It's partly to do with agency. So, if you are choosing to be on your own, and I'm somebody who's happy being on my own, reading a book, writing, playing music, these are moments of solitude. We might think of the term solitude, an active, positive experience of being alone, as distinct from craving connection and feeling that you're not getting it, craving to be seen or to be heard and feeling invisible.
So you would say that solitude and isolation, that what they have in common is being alone, and what they have differently is that only one features loneliness. Is that a good way of defining our terms?
Very nice. I like that.
Let's take a quick break now and hear from our sponsor. When I was a kid, one of the things that really, really bugged me was when I had socks that didn't fit, or they had a seam that was touching me. And I was like kind of sensitive, and I would be fidgeting and taking my shoes off, and my parents would say, "Put your shoes back on. Why are you always fidgeting? Why are you always messing with your socks?" I said, "Because they're uncomfortable." Well, I remember my dad saying, "You'll grow out of it. When you're my age, you won't even notice that sort of thing." Well, my dad was right on almost everything. Boy, was my dad a smart guy. But on that, he actually wasn't right. I still hate socks that don't fit, that slip down into my shoe, where the seam is irritating me all the time. And I finally found the socks that I like that don't have any of those terrible features. On the contrary, they have the features that I'm really looking for, that they keep my feet dry, they don't slip around, they give me stability and support, thereby features. Features has created a sock with a custom-like fit to prevent the issues that conventional socks have. No more bunching, no more slipping, no friction, and no blisters. Multiple cushion levels from ultralight to max cushioning for unsurpassed performance. I know this is true. I'm wearing them right now. I like them a lot. I wear them in the gym. I wear them when I walk to work. I wear them when I go running. They're great. They're really good for all sorts of athletic activities, but also for daily activities. They don't bother me in the way that so many other socks do, and they give me things that I like that keep my feet feeling dry and fresh. Features are engineered to help you achieve your very best every day, whether you're working or out on the go. The targeted compression acts like a hug around the arch of your foot, keeping the sock in place and preventing it from bunching, slipping, or sliding down into your shoe. You can work out harder, you can recover faster, you can get stronger, you can run faster, and they look great. You'll look great doing it. They also have a lifetime guarantee. Features are so durable and so long-lasting that if you're unsatisfied at any point, they'll give you your replacement pair with no questions asked. The company's family-owned. Hugh Gaither founded the company in 2002, and now he and his sons John and Joe own and operate the company in North Carolina. Their mission is to create products that help you achieve your personal best. See why Features has quickly become the #1 running sock in America and the #1 sock for the Art of Happiness listeners, including the host. For listeners of The Art of Happiness, you can receive $10 off your first pair of Features when you go to features.com/happiness. That's FEETURES, Features. Get it? Like feet.com/happiness for $10 off your first pair of Features. Okay, so now we've talked about young people and old people. Not old yet, but let's not. I don't want to push the point, but what about East versus West? Are you seeing a global phenomenon, or are you seeing a Western phenomenon?
So it's a myth that loneliness is an exclusively Western phenomenon. What we do know is that the more individualistic a culture, the lonelier it's likely to be, and more individualistic cultures do tend to be in the West. But what we're seeing is as Eastern and countries in the global South have become more individualistic, they're also becoming lonelier. And we're seeing loneliness epidemics now in as far afield as India, Africa, and even China. And, I find this link between growing individualism and growing loneliness fascinating. And we even see this in pop song lyrics, which since the 1980s have become steadily more individualistic, with words like we, us, and our being supplanted by words like I, me, and my. And we see this in China as well. So even with a strong state, and even in a non-capitalist environment, the neoliberal, me first, self-interested, selfish mindset increasingly taking hold, with consequences, with a growing loneliness problem there as well.
So you think that individualism and selfishness is higher than it was 15, 20, and 50 years ago? That's part of your hypothesis?
Yeah. I do.
I mean, because people were complaining about individuality or individualism or radical individualism, certainly, but selfishness and self-centered behavior and egocentricity back then too. But you think that objectively speaking, that has become more of a global crisis over the intervening decades and lies behind some of the loneliness epidemic.
I think over the past few decades, we've come to really valorize qualities such as selfishness and hyper-competitiveness in a way that we didn't before. And so there has been a kind of cultural shift with these values really kind of being upheld, and in the process, and at the same time, values like kindness, caring for others, compassion being disregarded, undervalued. Yeah, I believe that.
Some of the listeners to The Art of Happiness who've been following a lot of the work that we've been doing know that I had a long conversation with the Dalai Lama 2 weeks ago about exactly this topic. And we talked about how he believes that caring for one another, compassion for one another, unity, oneness, community, that these are human principles. This is basically our nature. And there's a conflict. There's an ideological conflict that is the conflict between two models of humanity. One being what he says is our state of nature, against which we are acting unnaturally with our self-centeredness and radical individualism. And others who say that we tend toward isolation, and against that nature, we have to actually come together in community. And it's interesting because, this is a non-trivial, not just a philosophical, discussion of how many angels fit on the head of a pin. You're basically saying, no, if we get this wrong, the consequences are really dire. So let me go to that. Let's go to the who cares question, right? I mean, I know we care because, you have students coming into your office who are suffering, and so do I. But more importantly, or at least as importantly, you have a lot of data, and you talk about this a lot in your book, about the consequences that we're all going to face as a society in terms of health, in terms of happiness, in terms of prosperity. So walk us through some of this. Walk us through the who cares question about this epidemic of loneliness.
Sure. So loneliness, we know, and this is really clear now from over a decade of very strong scientific research, we know that loneliness is very bad for our health. Not only our mental health, which may be more obvious, with links between loneliness and increased rates of anxiety, increased rates of depression, and even increased rates of suicide, but also our physical health. It's partly because, to speak to the Dalai Lama's point, is that in evolutionary terms, we actually were not designed to be alone. And so when we are on our own, what happens is our body goes into a kind of fight or flight mode. Our blood pressure goes up, our levels of cortisol go up, our heart rate goes up. all of these signals in our body kind of telling us, go and find a tribe, go and find people to hunt and gather with, because that's how you're going to be safe. And in the modern world, what is happening is that we are not doing that. And instead, we're staying in this state of aloneness, undesirable aloneness, loneliness, in the same way that a car, if it's put in first gear, that's what you want to put your car in to accelerate. But if you remain in first gear for a whole journey, or even worse, for repeated journeys, well, that's going to be really bad for your engine. And that's what's happening. We're going into this state of fight or flight mode to get rid of being lonely, but we don't act on it. So we stay in that state. And that has really bad health effects. I mean, as bad, it's been estimated as smoking 15 cigarettes a day, with people who are lonely 30% more likely to die prematurely than people who are not. And what's particularly, that is obviously very concerning in its own right. What's particularly concerning right now is that studies have shown that even relatively short periods of loneliness, so periods under 2 years of people feeling lonely, can have marked health impacts, including diminishing life expectancy. And, given that we're all now living through this state of collective enforced isolation, this is really worrying.
Yeah, for sure. I guess it's worth pointing out that if you're going to smoke 15 cigarettes a day, at least do it with others, so you don't compound the problem that we're talking about here. Now, it's interesting because a lot of what you're telling me is consistent with with the basic neurophysiology of alertness and threat. And so the whole idea is that when you're alone, you are more open to threat. At least the evolutionary psychology would suggest that we perceive ourselves to be uniquely under threat and therefore have to be in a state of high alert. Being in a state of high alert is the amygdala, the limbic system, is signaling to the pituitary gland to kick out cortisol and epinephrine in kind of a slow drip, which has tremendously deleterious health consequences over the long term. So most likely, or at least it's arguable that that's one of the things that's just breaking us down. That's the first gear analogy, right? Is that fair to say?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it's not just our health that loneliness is impacting, to go to the why should we care again question. It's also our wealth, because there's a lot of research to show that lonely workers are less productive, less efficient, less motivated, more likely to leave a company than workers who are not. For example, workers who don't have friends at a company are much less likely to feel engaged at work or engaged with their organization. So significant economic cost too, not only in terms of the health-related economic cost, but actually in terms of lost productivity.
And you talked about the 15 cigarettes analogy, which is really visceral. And we always talk this way in social science so that people can get their minds around what we're saying, to create a benchmark or a yardstick for what we're saying. So do you have some sort of an economic yardstick? Is there something that loneliness is doing to the economy that is comparable to a major recession, comparable to the pandemic or the financial crisis or something? Do you have anything like that, or do we not know yet?
We don't have, unfortunately, this kind of a kind of great pop stat to symbolize it, but we do know from studies that have been done, we can see in practice what happens when people don't feel lonely at work, and how improved it is. There's a wonderful story. Researchers were studying firefighters in the United States, and they wanted to understand why some companies of firefighters performed better than others. And what they found was that companies of firefighters who ate together performed twice as well as companies of firefighters that didn't. So being bonded to each other, feeling connected to each other, had that marked an impact. And there was another piece of research done where a company decided to trial getting all their employees to have their breaks at the same time. And again, they found a massive increase in productivity when employees had their breaks together. So we do know from a kind of array of studies, we can see in really tangible terms a marked impact on productivity when people feel connected to their colleagues. And so, yeah, we can see that.
Yeah, the Gallup polling organization, which does really some of the best work on workforce engagement, shows that having a best friend at work is the best predictor of engagement, is the best predictor of productivity, is the best predictor of not leaving your job. Having a best friend at work is a very important quality of life indicator, and it's entirely consistent with what you're saying. The most obvious problems with loneliness are not health and money. They're happiness and happiness per se. And increasingly, I'm delighted to report that people are studying happiness. This is my key area. And I think it's important that I believe that we can understand happiness, that we can apply the science to our lives, and we can share it with others. So, and we're going to get to some solutions on this, but is there anything in particular you want to talk about what the data say about just your level of happiness if you're lonely? It's more than self-evident. I mean, there has to be something where your likelihood of saying you're very happy in your life must be dramatically lower if you suffer from loneliness than if you don't, correct?
Dramatically. I mean, we know from kind of various measures of well-being that people who feel lonely have lower levels of well-being, which of course includes happiness, which is why, and you talk about the fact that it's fantastic that happiness is now being kind of really studied and taken seriously, including in policy circles. And I'm sure you're aware that the Prime Minister of New Zealand last year announced that she was going to put well-being measures, including happiness and loneliness mitigation, right at the heart of the budgetary process in New Zealand. So not only looking at traditional economic indicators like how well the country was doing on measures like growth and increases of GDP, but also on how well the country was doing when it came to their citizens feeling lonely or happy, or also measures like whether citizens trusted each other or not, and taking those into account when designing their policies and programs. And this all makes sense. It's a virtuous circle. A happy community, a happy citizenry who feel connected to each other is going to be healthier, wealthier, and also, I argue, more likely to support notions of an inclusive democracy, because there's a lot of talk in the United States at the moment about the need to come together again and to reunite and to reconnect. And one of the things that I found in my research was that loneliness threatens that lonely people are more prone to see the world as a hostile place, are more prone to be less trusting of outsiders, which is in part why we see the link between right-wing populists and the lonely, because right-wing populists, whether Trump in the United States or Le Pen in France, have done particularly well at speaking to the craving for community that so many people have. But by providing and delivering a community, albeit a very exclusive and excluding one.
So, and is that, in your view, a right-wing phenomenon or a political radicalism phenomenon? So we have Antifa in the United States, for example, that is very, very similar to the right-wing populist movements, especially those that are radical and dangerous. Is that the same thing?
So I think what Trump rallies and QAnon believers and the Redditors who were kind of converging around GameStop have in common is that they are groups of people who feel lonely, who are craving community and finding it in these various places. So there are people out there who are feeling isolated, who are feeling invisible, who feel that they're not heard, who feel that they're not seen, and they are craving community. And whoever delivers that community to them best, in their minds, is where they will go to. And right-wing populists have tended to do that particularly well in recent years.
Let's take a quick break now and hear from one of our sponsors. One of the things that I find curious as an economist is how people make their consumption decisions and sometimes make mistakes in how they allocate their resources. And here's a perfect example. People will spend a lot of money and time on something they do almost never because it feels like a luxury. And the thing that doesn't feel like a luxury, they do every single day, they'll skimp, they'll economize. And the result is that they don't get the enjoyment they would get simply by virtue of the frequency with which they're consuming something. A perfect example of this is that people will spend tons of money on restaurant meals, but they'll skimp on the ingredients for the food that they make at home every single night. And the result is that they enjoy their day after day meals less. They get less enjoyment, all in all. Same thing is true with how they drive or where they live. And I think as often as not, I see this in how people sleep. You get into your bed every single night. You might as well have the sheets that feel good and help you have a good night's sleep. Well, I have figured out that really matters. I'm no sheet connoisseur, I will tell you, but I have these new Boll & Branch sheets on my bed. They're so soft and they're so light that I'm sleeping better than I have in a long time. I have trouble sleeping. It's one of my big problems. I'm always too hot or I'm too cold or the sheets are bunching up and I'm uncomfortable and I'm tossing and turning. I didn't actually know that if I got the right sheets, it was going to improve that. And sure enough, it has. Boll & Branch promised that, and they followed through. They make the softest organic sheets in the market, and they actually get better with every wash. You wash the sheets, they get softer. So this is important because you want them to last a long time, and you want them to get better with age, and Boll & Branch sheets do that. They also use 100% sustainable raw materials. They're the first fair trade certified manufacturer of linen. And so if that's important to you, which is to a lot of our listeners, you can feel as good about your Boll & Branch sheets as they feel against your skin. The Boll & Branch signature sheets, they come in 7 beautiful colors. I have white on my bed. That's what my wife wanted. And they look great, but the lights are off, so who knows? All I know is I'm sleeping better. And they come in all sizes, from a twin bed up to a California king. What, I ask you, is a California king? I bet it's not as big as a Texas king. Anyway, turns out that if you have a huge bed, Boll & Branch has got sheets for you. They're made to a higher standard, 100% organic cotton, ethical production, and thoughtful attention to every detail. Now, best of all, Boll & Branch gives you a fair price, plus a 30-day risk-free trial and free shipping and free returns. Experience the best sheets you've ever felt at bollandbranch.com. Get 15% off your first set of sheets when you use the promo code Arthur at checkout. That's Boll & Branch, BOLLAND, branch.com, promo code Arthur. Let's talk about some reasons for this now, because this is really, we're not going to be able to get to solutions until we talk about, we not just diagnose the problem, but we actually talk about the cause. And then once we have the cause well in hand, I know you've got a lot of solutions, which is one of the great virtues of this book and why people should read it. This is not just a, oh no, we're in trouble book. This is a, we're in trouble, but we can solve the problem book, which is really good. So I've got a bunch of categories, and I'm just going to throw them out there, and then you tell me how these things have contributed or not to the loneliness crisis, okay? Okay, let's start with the most obvious one that people are talking about all the time, social media.
Yes, has contributed. I was agnostic when I began my research. I wasn't sure. I dug into the academic literature. I'd say up until about 2 years ago, it was hard to establish categorically whether it was lonely people turning to social media more or whether social media was actually making people feel lonely. But about 18 months ago, there was a landmark study done by Stanford University, a real gold standard of a study. They had 3,000 participants. Half the group continued using Facebook as usual. The other half were told to stay off Facebook for 2 months, and the results were very clear. The group who stayed off Facebook were considerably happier, did considerably more in person with friends and family, so it wasn't that they just went and hung out on other sites online, and were significantly less lonely. And since then, there have been a few other studies which have replicated these sorts of results. It makes sense. Firstly, we know from months now of being forced to have so many of our relationships online and virtually. I think we're all more aware than ever that these are lesser quality relationships than in-person, face-to-face ones. So if you're spending your time on social media and communicating that way, it's already going to be a lower quality communication. On social media, it's almost as if you're gorging on your connections in the same way that you're gorging on fast food. So you speak, you tweet, you post, and yet you don't feel fully sated afterwards. Part of the reason these media make people feeling lonely is because they can be very excluding for a lot of people. That was something that came out time and time again from the stories. Teenagers that I interviewed told me, people like Peter, the 14-year-old, who told me that he would post on Instagram and then be waiting, hoping for somebody to like his post, and nobody would like it. And he'd say that he felt so invisible. But social media, of course, also making the world an angrier place, a more aggressive place, a meaner place. 65% of UK students have experienced cyberbullying firsthand on social media. And a hateful, toxic world is inevitably going to feel lonelier. So social media, definitely a culprit. I would go as far as to say that social media companies are in many ways the tobacco companies of the 21st century and should be regulated as such, especially when it comes to the young.
Interesting. And the parallel that you made is not trivial between social media and junk food, because one of the interesting things about modern life that we typically see, and we often see, is that in communities of poverty that suffer from poverty, you can have both obesity and malnutrition happening at the same time. This was totally unthinkable 50 years ago. Mm-hmm. The idea that if you were overweight, that you could also be malnourished. And it comes from the fact that it's low nutrient density, high calorie foods, which you're telling me is basically social media. So you can be both gorging on contact with other people and profoundly lonely at the same time. This is sort of the burgers and fries and milkshakes of human contact, and the data are there. If you want to be less lonely, you should be less on social media. Is that fair to say?
Absolutely, for sure. And yet it's so hard to do it once you're on it because it's so addictive, because they've designed it to be so addictive. Yeah.
I mean, dopamine is dopamine, and we understand how the neurotransmitter, the neuromodulator works. You want more. It creates desire. The desire creates the desire per se. The same thing is with French fries as with Twitter. So next topic, the modern economy.
So, definitely, I think also plays a part. We know that there is a relationship between loneliness and income levels. We know that people on low income and people who are unemployed are disproportionately lonely. We've been living through an era in which the gap between rich and poor has increased. We know that earnings for low skilled, lower income, white blue-collar workers has flatlined really since the 1980s in real terms. So there are a number of people who in economic terms feel left behind, forsaken, who also feel lonelier. So economics, I think, playing a part in that regard for sure. But also economics playing a part in terms of the mindset that we've already touched upon, this neoliberal mindset in which we came to see ourselves over the past 30 years, I would argue, as competitors rather than collaborators, as hustlers rather than helpers, and came to think, well, if I don't look out for myself, who will? The state, no. The market, no. So I need to focus on myself. But of course, a self-focused world was always going to be inevitably a lonelier one.
Do you think that a inveterate and proud neoliberal like me is therefore going to necessarily be lonely and bring loneliness? Or is there something that I can do to maintain my neoliberal views and still not be lonely? So
to be clear, I'm not anti-capitalist at all. And when I'm critiquing neoliberalism, what I'm really critiquing is a very particular form of capitalism that became dominant over the past 30 years. Because capitalism, if you think about Franklin Roosevelt's capitalism, for example. I mean, this was a capitalism which, he clearly said was about serving the people, not seeking to master them. If we think about different models of capitalism that in which innovation has thrived in Asia, across Europe, these were forms of capitalism too, but they were forms of capitalism which acknowledged that the state also has a role to play in providing, for example, an infrastructure of community, libraries, public parks, daycare centres, youth clubs. There are roles for the state to play in helping us feel less lonely and not come and feel more connected to each other. And that's what's happened over the past few decades, is that we've seen the state withdraw, especially, in fact, since 2008. In the United States, federal library funding has fallen by 40% since 2008. So we've seen the state withdraw from providing this infrastructure of community that is so important. And even if you cast yourself as a kind of staunch neoliberal, I mean, even, of course, Adam Smith, the father in many ways of capitalism, he was very clear that community was important, that the state had a role to play here, and that care and compassion mattered too. So this message isn't an anti-capitalist one. It's just saying that capitalism and community are not irreconcilable. They actually can be reconnected. Just in the past few decades, we've lost our way.
So just a quick liner note for some of our American listeners who might be confused by the terminology that you and I are using. This is classic, how economists talk to each other in shorthand all over the globe. Neoliberal means classically liberal, which is not to say in the American political context liberal, which is left wing. Liberal means, somebody who's an adherent of market forces and the free enterprise system, generally speaking. And neoliberal is sort of the new movement back toward the use of capitalism and free enterprise to distribute goods and services in an efficient way. And like any other system, systems have consequences. And one of the things that I always say is that you have to remember that morals need to come before markets, that people need to come before things. And to the extent that we forget that, it doesn't really matter what the political system is or what the economic system is. In point of fact, some of the greatest isolation, depression, suicide rates, drug abuse, alcoholism that I've ever seen are in socialist economies, are in the former Soviet economies. They're horrible, and nobody would accuse them of being neoliberal. So your point is obviously not that it's capitalism per se, but it's just
absolutely. And I actually worked in Russia in the early 90s, so just after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and I saw firsthand the terrible, terrible, terrible state people were in. So, be clear, this message is not an anti-capitalist one, but I feel that we're actually, on the same page here. We're saying, you can't put profit before people. You can't put the market before morality, and capitalism and community can be reconnected, and they can.
Let's take a break now and hear from our sponsor. Think about over the past year how many contradictory pieces of information you've seen and heard on the internet about how to get healthy, how to eat right, how to get in shape. It seems like no matter what you want to do, there are experts on exactly opposite sides of every issue that have the same amount of credibility or perhaps the same lack of credibility. Should you, to get in shape and get healthier, follow the old school food pyramid? Or should you ditch that? You can find equal numbers of people on each side. Should you eat salt or not eat salt? Should you eat a lot of fat, or should you minimize the amount of fat that you take in? What about carbohydrates? What about protein? Should you go keto or should you go vegan? Look, there's just experts all over the place with fancy titles telling you contradictory things. You just don't know where to turn. Well, enter Noom. See, it's not about what you're eating, but how you eat in general. Noom teaches you about eating, about your cravings, and how to build new habits. So you can ditch your misconceptions and get smart about food and the choices you make. Noom is based in psychology, teaching you how to eat so you can accomplish your personal health goals and stick with them long term. You don't need rules to lose weight. You need knowledge about yourself so you can manage yourself. With Noom, you pick health goals that are right for you. You'll personalize a weight loss program if that's your goal, and Noom will help your aspirations actually become a reality and stay reality, so you don't become a statistic in the failure rate of diets. I have used Noom and I like it a lot. Before I actually accepted this sponsorship, I used it because that's what I always do. I make sure that I believe in the organizations that sponsor the Art of Happiness. And, I had some goals. One of the things that I wanted to be able to do was to eat healthier through greater knowledge of how many calories and what the macronutrients in my food were. I'm kind of a gym rat. I'm a little bit of a health nut, as a matter of fact, but there was knowledge that I was lacking. Noom helped me actually understand the caloric content of food just by looking at it. I became a much more intuitive eater, and it's helped me a lot. It's actually helped me with, the weight that I want to maintain and how I want to feel, so that when I'm in the gym, I feel better. Noom is directly responsible for helping my performance. It's also incredibly easy. I can do it on 10 minutes a day. The program is, easy to start. People are really, really friendly. Depending on what you want, you can have a community of people who are supporting you, and you'll certainly have a coach. Food logging just couldn't be easier. It's also forgiving and empathetic. So when you slip up and you have a weekend where you're binging a little bit or you're eating things that you shouldn't, you just get right back on. It's not like it's all over and you failed. Noom works with my lifestyle, and it'll work with yours as well. So you don't have to commit to something insane where you completely change your lifestyle. Noom is based in psychology, teaching why you make the choices that you do and giving you the tools to replace your bad habits with healthier ones. It has a cognitive behavioral approach, meaning you're not just losing weight, you're building the habits you need to keep the weight off. Over 80% of Noomers finish the program, and over 60% have stuck with their goals for at least 1 year. Those are unbelievable statistics compared to the rest of the diet and nutrition industry. There's a science to getting healthier. It's called Noom. So sign up today for your trial at Noom. That's Noom.com/Arthur. Learn how to eat again. Sign up for your trial today at Noom, Noom.com/Arthur. You ready to learn how to live healthier? So sign up today. Noom.com/Arthur. And you talked about the link between capitalism and community largely falling in the state. But before we do that, let's talk about the linkage in the United States that's typically existed that's fraying in a big way, which is religious activity, which is community life largely organized around faith. And the fact that secularization is occurring, I have to think that secularization is a much, much bigger force in the rise of loneliness than, the government pulling back since 2008. Would you agree with that or not?
Well, there are a number of forces, and definitely rising secularization, and more broadly, people doing less with other people than they did in the past is clearly a cause. People go to church less, people go to synagogue less, but people also are less likely to be members of trade union. People are less likely to be members of parent-teacher associations. People are more likely to live on their own. So all of these contributory factors, for sure. And this is even more likely than a decade ago. So we've seen a marked increase on all those fronts. And yes, they're definitely part of the problem here too. It's a complex issue for sure. So
people who are really worried about loneliness, one of the things that they might work on is not just, Noreena Hertz is not telling us we all have to be big government people. We might be big church people. There's lots of ways that we can do this in the third sector, in the voluntary sector, and in civil society. So even if you're a limited government person, you can still work on the loneliness problem by non-governmental means. Correct?
Well, I think it's not either or. So I think the debate is sometimes framed as if you have to be, it's either us as individuals who can solve it, or it's government who should solve it. I don't think either of those are quite right. I think there's definitely a lot that we can do as individuals and should do as individuals. We shouldn't leave this all to government by any means. And yet I do think there are important interventions that governments can make to help people feel less lonely, for sure. So it's striking the balance between the two.
What about the arguments that we've heard going all the way back to, I don't know, the turn of the century with the short stories of Franz Kafka, the bureaucratization of our society and the mechanization, the treatment of our complex adaptive human culture is one of, complication through the growth of the state. Are you sympathetic at all to the arguments that bureaucratic societies, they tend to lead to alienation and then to loneliness, and that's getting worse?
Again, my Russia experience will only confirm that, for sure. I mean, I'm definitely not calling for kind of big anonymous bureaucracies. And I think there's a lot that local governments can do. When I talk about government, I'm not only talking about federal government, for sure. I'm also talking about states. I'm talking about cities. Lots that can be done at the local level and needs to be done. And if you think about something like our local shops and restaurants and cafes, these are businesses, independent stores that are really suffering right now, struggling with pandemic, with the economic downturn, with the shift to e-commerce that they're having to contend with as well. I think there is a role for government clearly to play in helping them get back on their feet over the coming months and years. Because without it, I think they may well not survive. And you may think, well, why does this matter? And why is this connected to loneliness? Well, actually, it's in these places. It's in our local cafes. It's in our local bookstores that we often have these micro exchanges, the hello, the how are you, the chat, that makes us feel connected to other people and to each other. These local stores really anchor our neighborhoods. And so, that would be a way at a local level and perhaps at a local government level that we could see really meaningful interventions. One of the things I call for in my book is a new tax status for pro-community businesses. So businesses which are demonstrably pro-community should get some sort of tax benefit. And also when we talk about social media, that's another place where we need government, I believe, to intervene. This isn't about knee-jerk big government being the solution for everything, but we've seen the market fail to rein in social media. We've seen social media companies not be willing to make the changes themselves. So in those kind of cases, I do believe the government does have to step in. And yet solutions are not all government by any means. So much we can do, so much we should do.
Yeah, no, it's important to realize that you're making a pretty standard economic argument about public bads and market failures, et cetera, and that loneliness is a product of a market failure in many cases, in which case we should try to remediate that somehow, whether it's individually or with the state, is another matter. So let me ask you one more question before we go through a battery of solutions, although we've actually started on the solutions already. My research and that which I've done, I've interviewed Jean Twenge at San Diego State University, the great, really visionary social psychologist out there, a bunch of times. And Jean shows that young people are, something like 30 percentage points less likely to date than they were 30 years ago, maybe a third less likely to be in love. So to what extent is I'm not going to ask why people are no longer interested in romantic activity. That's a different show. But, the fact that unambiguously young people are feeling more fear, more reluctance to put themselves in sort of emotional harm's way. And the result is they're less likely to be romantically involved. How much is that, this, I think, a metastatically sad trend among young people today? How much is this behind the loneliness epidemic, in your view, among people coming into your office?
That question brings to mind somebody I met in my research, a man called Carl. I had heard that there was a growth in people who were paying to be cuddled, people who were so craving connection and intimacy that they were paying, that they were looking to the market to solve it. And I interviewed a professional cuddler Jean from Venice Beach, California. And she told me that it was such a growth phenomenon. This is before the pandemic. Presumably the pandemic put it on hold for the time being. But there was such a growth phenomenon that in the Las Vegas Cuddler Convention of 2019, there were more professional cuddlers than at any time before. But she introduced me to some of her clients, and one of them who I met was a man called Carl. Carl was is a media executive at a leading media corporation. And I met with him. We met in a cafe. He was wearing chinos and button-down shirt, a nice-looking man. And he told me about how he'd moved to Los Angeles. He was divorced. He was feeling very lonely. He was really craving intimacy and connection, and he felt very distraught. And then he heard about professional cuddling, and he started paying to see Jean, and he said it transformed his life. Now, to be clear, I established this wasn't a sexual thing, because you might think it's a sexual thing. No, this is really about people wanting to be held, to be hugged, have somebody, touch their arm. And so he told me the story and about how it changed his life, and it was actually very moving. And then he said to me, "You're not using my real name in the book, are you?" And I said, "No." And he said, "Okay, well then I need to tell you, in the past few months, it hasn't been enough seeing Jean, and I've started seeing a couple of other people to be cuddled too." And I said, "Gosh, this must be quite expensive." And he said, "It is." And I said, "How do you pay for it?" And he said, "I live in my car." And this is a media executive, who is so craving intimacy and connection that he is now living in his car, keeping his food in the fridge at work, showering in the 24/7 gym, just in order to have connection and intimacy. I mean, what a stain on our society that this is going on.
Sure. I mean, let's presume that is a special case, that is an outsized case of a phenomenon that, given the fact that it's so outlandish and amazing, there probably are some pathologies that are involved in this as well. But your point is well taken, that the fact that there is a market for Jean, that there's a market for cuddlers, and there's a cuddlers convention. Wow.
Yeah.
This is, you gotta love capitalism, but that's not your point. Your point is that the market exists because the problem is there, and people are meeting that problem.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. One last thing before we go on to solutions, which is cancel culture. It's no surprise to anybody paying attention on either side of the Atlantic that there is a culture that is shutting people down, that is intimidating people from having a conversation with a competition of ideas, that free speech is becoming more and more difficult. You're socially reprobate and canceled if you have the wrong sort of opinion. And these are, not talking outlandish opinions. We're talking about, normal mainstream opinions in many cases. And it's aided and abetted by social media. To what extent do you think that the inability for people to express themselves is going to be implicated in the loneliness epidemic, particularly among young people on campuses, among other places?
Well, it's clearly, a worrying phenomenon when people can't express ideas and different intellectual points of view, for sure. And, and one of the things that came out time and time again in my research was that loneliness was about people also feeling unable to be heard, unable to be seen. The trouble with social media, of course, is that on it, people compete to be the shrillest possible, the most hateful possible, because actually we know that tweets with hateful words in them get retweeted 30% more than other sorts of tweets. So the whole mechanism is designed, the algorithm is designed to reward the shrillest and the most hateful. And that's, it's a problem when we can't civilly disagree.
Yeah, of course.
Fine. We just need to be able to do it civilly.
Yeah, for sure. And that's a problem in a lot of different areas. And it's a problem for progress. It's going to be a big economic problem. And it can actually lead to the kind of social discord that is bad for happiness, bad for health, bad for everything. But among other things, if you are shut down and you have a particular point of view and you're isolated as a result of your point of view, it can't be good for good for your happiness, and it will be aiding in your loneliness. I take the point. Let's take a quick break now and hear a word from our sponsor. I want to talk about a podcast I really like that I think you should be listening to, because I do. It's called The Jordan Harbinger Show. You probably already heard about it, and I'm going to say, you got to listen to it. I know every day somebody tells you there's some podcast you have to listen to, and you say, okay, fine, and then you don't. Well, don't let that happen here. Jordan Harbinger's show, which Apple named one of its best of 2018, is aiming to make you better informed, a more critical thinker, so you can get a sense of how the world actually works and come to your own conclusion about what's happening, even inside your own brain. I like it a lot. As I said, I'm a regular listener. I learn a lot every time. Jordan Harbinger is an outstanding interviewer. He's interviewed me, and I've been on the show. I really liked it, and that's when I really got kind of hooked on it. Each episode is a conversation with a different guest who's always interesting. And when I say there's something for everybody, I really mean it. You're going to find something that hooks you in every show. And there's one episode where Jordan talks to a hostage negotiator from the FBI, and he offers techniques on how to get people to like and trust you, which is great, as if you were being holed up in a building and they were trying to talk you out. That sounds useful and disturbing at the same time. There's another episode that tells the story of a cinematographer who discovered a lost city in the jungle and made one of the most important archaeological finds of all time. The last two episodes that I listened to are one from Ramit Sethi, which is entitled, I Will Teach You to Find Your Dream Job. Well, the truth is I already have my dream job, but I wanted to know because I'm teaching graduate students and I want to be able to give good advice. And I got great advice from that. The other one, this is great. Thomas Erickson, Jordan interviews him on this topic, how to protect yourself from psychopaths. You don't want to miss that. Jordan is always focused on pulling useful, practical insights out of his brilliant guests. I mean, brilliant except for when he interviewed me. And we're not talking about pop psychology or wishy-washy self-help. The episodes are loaded with bits of wisdom that you can use to change your own mind and improve your life right away. If that's not worth checking out, I'm not sure what is. Now, I really enjoy this show, and I think you will as well. So search for The Jordan Harbinger Show. That's Harb as in boy, IN as in Nancy, GER, on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Let's talk about some solutions, even though I think that we're really on that trail. And let's start at the individual level, not to be excessively individualistic, of course, but what do you recommend, given the fact that you've done all this research as a social scientist, to a person who's feeling intensely lonely?
So one of the best things to do if you're actually feeling lonely is actually to reach out to someone else yourself. We know that if you volunteer, do voluntary work, if you help someone else, not only does that make you feel less lonely, but you actually get this dopamine high, this elusive thing that we're all chasing. You actually get what's known as a helper's high. And it's good for your long-term health. There's studies that show that people who don't help anyone, die. Are more likely to die prematurely than people who do help others. So one of the things is to reach out to others, actually, if you're feeling lonely. I know that can be hard to do, but if you can push yourself to do that, it can make a real difference. The other thing is to think about, are there communities of interest that you might be able to tap into? So, maybe you like music. Is there some sort of group related to music that you like? Is there a book club you could join? Is there something that you could do with other people? That's something to do if you're feeling lonely as well. But there's a lot we can do individually to help others not feel lonely, including ourselves. Top of the list must be putting down our phones more and being more present with each other. We're all guilty of it, of sitting in the room with our partner or our family on our phones, not really with them, not really focusing on them. I know it's hard because these devices are so addictive, but you really have to try and move that phone so that it's not within arm's reach, and be there with with your partner and with your family member. Even when couples have a phone between them and the phone is turned off on a table, the couple feels less connected to each other and less empathetic. So that's one thing we can do. The other thing we can do, we've talked a bit about the importance of our local shops, our local stores, especially right now. Really think about supporting them in whichever ways we can. These are absolutely essential. They are the anchors for our community, the anchors for our neighborhoods, and we need to do what we can to help them and not be lured into the convenience of contactless shopping, which is all too easy, but actually recognize that sometimes there is a trade-off to be made between convenience and community. I think another thing that we can do more generally is value kindness more in our friends, in our colleagues, in our partners, in our family members. Kindness isn't something we've really valued explicitly in recent years, and we can do much better on that front. And then also we can think about each of us, whether we're feeling lonely or not, whether there's someone in our own network who might be lonely, especially right now, and actively reach out to them, pick up the phone. If we can meet them face to face in a socially distanced way, meet up with them. Just showing someone that you're thinking about them, that you care, can make a huge difference to how they feel.
Now, you're somebody really deeply involved in public policy, and you've helped governments and you've taught the subject, et cetera, which is one of the reasons that we've gone back and forth and talked a little bit about government. So give me, in your view, the top 3 or 4 things that you would like to see the public sector do to attenuate this problem.
So first, take on social media. Social media companies are the tobacco companies of the 21st century. They need to be regulated as such, especially when it comes to children. I would go so far.
What do you mean by that? Just to be more specific, what would you like to see the government do to or with or regarding Facebook and Twitter and Instagram, et cetera?
So I would go as far as to say to ban addictive social media for under 16s, putting the onus then on social media companies to come up with products that are less addictive for this demographic. I would also say there are moves, for example, taking place in the United Kingdom right now about making sure that social media companies are held legally responsible for the mental health impact of what's on their platform when it comes to children. I think that sort of legislation makes sense. So that's something governments could do. The other thing governments can do, and again, this can be at a federal but also at a local level, is actively replenish the infrastructure of community that has been so depleted in recent years. We're never going to find common ground if there are no physical spaces that we share. And this can happen at micro levels as well. There was a great initiative that Rahm Emanuel did when he was mayor of Chicago, whereby he built new social housing blocks which had branches of the Chicago Public Library on the ground floor. Fantastic initiative, so that there were physical spaces where residents could come together, but not only residents, but would also attract people in the neighborhood more broadly to come and be together. So that's a great initiative. There's lots of local government initiatives I talk about in my book. And then I think another important thing that government can do is make sure that employers give employees time off to care. I'm not just talking about employees getting time off after pregnancy and when they've had children to be able to care for newborns and babies. I'm talking about more broadly, we need to make provision of care more comprehensive and easier for everyone, because it's hard if you're on a low-income job, if you've got precarious work, it's hard sometimes to find that time to commit to your local church fete or committee. Hard to find that time and be able to make that commitment to coach your kids' softball game, softball team. And I think there is a role the state can play in making employers have to provide more care I have to enable employees to care more.
Well, we've got a lot of solutions, and there's a lot of content out there because we've been talking for an hour about this problem. But it's actually, I'm more hopeful now than when we started because, I've been looking at this epidemic for several years now. And I feel like you've given me a handle on a lot of things that we can do individually, that communities can do. And who knows, maybe governments can do some of these things as well, or maybe they might in some places. So let me sum up. And I really love, by the way, your individual solutions. I think they're really great. I mean, I kind of put them into 4 baskets. So tell me if I'm right. But first, let's make sure as we sum up for our listeners, whether or not you agree that the problem that we have with loneliness is really one of isolation, not of solitude. That it leads to an unnatural state of isolation, which creates the simulacrum of threat. And so for our listeners who really like being alone, that's not the problem. That's not the problem at all. Is that fair to say?
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's about not choosing to be in this state of isolation.
That the epidemic is global, that it cuts across race and religion and gender, that it affects all of us because it's a human problem, not a particular demographic problem. Fair?
Fair, but some groups are lonelier than others, but everyone is affected, especially now.
And everyone's at risk, which is a key part of what you're saying.
Absolutely. Everyone's at risk.
The danger is not just to our happiness, which is self-evident, problematic, but self-evident, but left untreated, it can be terrible for public health. And ultimately, it's going to be a threat to our economies, right?
Absolutely.
The reasons are manifold, and they range from social media, which paradoxically, the promise was it was going to connect us, and it's making us lonelier. Excessive individualism, pulling away from community, secularization or falling civil society, bureaucratization and cold alienation, the way that we've misused the tools of economic freedom. There are lots and lots of ways, or lots and lots of reasons. Is that fair to say?
Yes, lots of reasons, which is why there's so much we can do to fix it.
Exactly right, which leads to the best news of all, which is there's a bunch of solutions from the most individual to the most collective. The individual solutions, I put them into 4 baskets. If you are lonely, if you're a lonely person, and people listening to us are lonely people, Noreena Hertz, having looked exhaustively at the literature, suggests to use what we call in social science an opposite signal strategy. When you feel lonely, you want to cocoon and hope people will come to you, perhaps. That's the wrong thing to do. Don't cocoon and go to others. So if you move into a new community and you're profoundly lonely, start inviting people over to your house for dinner, even if they're not inviting you for dinner. That's number 1. Number 2 is and it's related to number 1, is getting involved, is reaching out to other people and actually being social, and helping other people, I should say. So the first is doing what extroverted, connected people would do. The second is actually helping people, becoming more charitable, volunteering more, doing things that actually serve other people more, because there's an iron law of happiness, which is you should give what you want to get. And that is a perfect case in point. The third is put down the damn phone. Come on, put down the phone. I mean, the phone is killing you. It's hurting you. It's destroying your relationships. It's making you lonely. And number 4 is act local. We're in an infotainment culture in which everybody pays attention to national politics. People watch television that's almost exclusively national. We pay attention to national things. We shop in national chains. Get more local. That's number 1 through 4 is help others, get involved socially, put down your phone, and go local. Is that 4 good bins, Noreena?
4 excellent bins. Yes.
Well, they're your bins. So I'm trying to summarize here, and I think that they're really important. And I want our listeners to remember this, but more importantly, to read the book, because that's what really puts flesh on the bones. And finally, when we're talking about what the government can do, and this is going to be more controversial to our listeners, but I want everybody with an open mind to simply consider these ideas. Number one is that social media companies, they're creating a product, according to Noreena Hertz, that's creating a huge loneliness crisis, isolation crisis. So the government needs to take it on as a public bad, to regulate them, to hold them accountable, even ban products as appropriate. The second is to replenish infrastructure in communities, parks, social housing, et cetera, as some places are doing. And the last is to think about laws, labor laws in particular, that would make it easier for people to band together. Those are three possible strategies. Once again, I know people in our listener base are going to say, no, I don't want the government to do that. Fine. But think about these things with an open mind and think about private sector parallels to those things, because I think it's manifestly sensible that we be connected to each other, that we have more social infrastructure, that we not misuse social media. If you don't want the government to do these things that Noreena Hertz is recommending, then what are you going to do in your community with the tools that are available for collective action to get these things done outside of government? Because I don't think anybody would argue that it's only good if the government does it. Fair point? Noreena?
Fair point. I think the government needs to step in if we can't solve it ourselves.
Yep, and that's spoken like Adam Smith. So I love this book, and I think what you're doing is really important. And together, I hope that we can actually provide solutions to this problem, or at least start making the world a little bit better place. I know that you are making the world a little bit better place. So Noreena Hertz, thank you so much for joining The Art of Happiness.
Thank you so much for having me on.
Well, I hope you've enjoyed that interview with Noreena Hertz as much as I did. I hope you found it illuminating. I hope you found it useful. And I hope it's been kind of a call to action for you, not just if you happen to be lonely, but if you know people who are, or you're concerned about the way our country is going, the way that our world is going. We need more connection. We need more love, because love is happiness. Full stop. This episode of The Art of Happiness was produced by CeCe Gallagly and Scott Immergut. The research assistant was Reese Brown. If you liked it, if you're interested in the show in general and you like this episode in particular, please do a few things for us. Please go to wherever you get your podcasts, Apple Podcasts or Stitcher or Spotify, and subscribe so that all of the episodes come directly to you, to your device. Second, it'd be great if you could leave us a rating, if you could even write a little review to talk about why you like the podcast, what you think about it, how we could make it better. But most importantly, you could give your feedback so other people can read that and they can enjoy the podcast as well. And finally, please share this with other people. We make this podcast because we want a world that has more happiness, in which we can lift people up and bring them together. You can be part of the movement that is The Art of Happiness if you share this with people who you believe could use it as profitably as well and as happily as you are. So thanks so much for listening. I'm looking forward to the next episode, and I hope you are too. Until then, this is The Art of Happiness, and I'm Arthur Brooks.
Ricochet. Join the conversation.